All right, so we're here to present some data from the elementary schools and the secondary schools just over the course of the year. I guess we'll just start.
Charlie, would you like a paper copy of our slides?
All 73 of them?
We
No,
do
just
not- we
yours?
do not
Of
have
course I
seven.
would.
We do not have 73 slides.
No, just.
We're saving it for us.
Of course I would.
So we are presenting on New Hampshire state assessment results and our spring NWEA map results. And how do you want, so you have control over the,
Yeah, I have the ability to control it. If you want it, I could give you the ability.
either way, and just.
Okay.
Next slide.
Yeah.
So in the elementary school, we do assessments 3 times a year, and except for kindergarten, everyone in the school does map testing in the fall and the winter. And then in the spring, we switch over and New Hampshire SAS becomes the whole grade level assessment for 3rd through 5th, while 1st and 2nd continue to take map testing. So that allows us to monitor progress throughout the year and do spring to spring testing. In the other grade levels, we might do fall to fall. We can run the reports in lots of different ways to look at individual progress. So starting with New Hampshire SAS, this graph explains the number of students that we had assessed at each of our eligible grade levels. And so there are slightly different measures here. The light blue bar is the number of students, and the darker blue bar is the percent of those students who were proficient or above. And those are whole district figures, so combining Ringe and Jaffrey.
Okay, so this is spring of 2022.
22.
Yeah. Our most recent data.
And we wanted to show whole district together to emphasize that's our goal, to think of ourselves as one unit.
Mhm.
And we're excited to have our 4 early release days next year, because that will allow our teams to build on thinking of themselves as one unit.
So, but then we did switch and start to give a breakdown. So that first chart gives you grades 3, 4, and 5 as an overview, how many students were proficient or above between both schools. But the next 3 slides, less than 2 more, kind of give an overview of individual grade levels by school, by those same proficiency ratings that are in New Hampshire SAS. So we would think of them as being above proficient, below proficient, approaching, or proficient, or levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. So if you actually go back, Nick, 2 slides to 3rd grade.
So if I go, yeah,
Yep. So the proficiency goes around the same way. So highly proficient is that sort of like mid blue, and then proficient is orange, approaching is the dark blue, and then that light blue is the below proficient. So we have both sets of data, one for RMS grade 3 and one for JGS grade 3. So as you look at that, you can see that from the first graph, we had 63% of our students between both grades, both schools for grade 3 were proficient, but you can see the breakdown a little bit more here. Clearly JGS having a much smaller triangle there for students who are significantly below or in that below proficient. Susan, I think, can speak more to some of the things that happened at JGS with 3rd grade, because the results that we saw there were really spectacular.
Right, so we're starting with a great slide for JGS.
Yeah.
I think it's both schools you know, we have our like, yeah, let's look at that slide. And then we have our others, you know, some that we.
Next
are-
slide.
are- Yeah,
So if I'm reading this right, we're talking about English language arts.
yes,
And from a proficiency perspective, in grade 3, JGS has roughly 76%.
Yep.
And RMS has 55%.
Yep.
Proficient.
there is a slide coming up that will have those numbers a little clearer to read, so we
Okay.
could look at it at there. So right now, if you look at, you know, sort of the colors, you can see what, how big of a pie are those left two colors, because that's where we want to be. So third grade had some great results, and actually Ruben and I just had a Zoom meeting with the third grade team today to talk about that, start conversation. Well, what did you do? And so that sharing back is for another time, but you know, some big things are strong PLC process,
Mhm.
strong use of data, strong teamwork, strong belief they're all our students, whether they're in my class or your class or identified or not, et cetera. So and I appreciate Ruben taking time to really help us look at that and figure out, you know, how can we share that out and build upon that.
And I think the next conversation too is not only to have that small conversation with the third grade team at JGS and Ruben and Susan, but is to expand that conversation. So we're having the same conversation. So third grade teachers at RMS are seeing what JGS teachers are doing to get great results. And then other grade level teachers as well. So
Right.
it won't stop there.
So that these slides go through that for the 3 grade levels, just again, looking at them, the results per school were a bit closer.
Yeah.
In 5th grade, they're, as far as the number proficient, quite close. So the next slide gives you a different visual of the numbers and does some comparisons year to year.
Mhm.
So the New Hampshire Department of Ed has not released, that I found anyway, overall statewide results for 2022 yet. And that's a key marker for us to look at. How are we doing in comparison to the state average? So I started on the left-hand side with what were the state averages for those grade levels last year. Certainly, I think everybody, both statewide and individual schools, I'm sure there will be some bounce back this year post-COVID, we would hope. I don't know, statewide numbers tend to be a little less inclined to jump up or down in big ways than an individual cohort might. But so as we look at these, and the next slide will go over some positives of this, but I think we did overall see some, you know, coming back this year after the COVID and period of remote learning and so forth. The green follows the same group of students, and the yellow follows a different group of students. So in some cases where maybe the grade level did not increase, the cohort might have increased. And looking across at a grade level is a great way to think about curriculum. You know, what are we doing with our resources, our instructional strategies, our scope and sequence, our rigor, and how is that impacting? And then, you know, balancing that with the look at the cohort also. So next.
So kind of switching gears a little bit and thinking about some of our younger learners. The next series of slides will follow the same kind of pattern as the information on the previous slides, but this is really focusing on our MAPS assessment on NWEA for 1st and 2nd graders because they don't engage with statewide assessments until 3rd grade. NWEA is a little bit different in that they don't get a proficient rating. And so the way that the data is presented from NWEA is in percentiles. So we think about breaking students into kind of 20 percentile categories. So those students that scored below the 21st percentile would be considered in the low category, all the way up to the above 20th, 80th percentile would be considered high. Typically, when you look at NWEA results, you think of average.
Nikki,
Yeah.
this is the percentile on the test?
Yep.
Okay,
So the number of students is on the left-hand side. So the number of students that scored in each percentile level for both grade 1 is light blue and grade 2 is dark blue. So what we're hoping to see is as many students in the third set, the third, fourth, and fifth columns, because that means that they're either scoring at the average percentile or higher. So NWA would consider average to be 40 percentile or higher. We would hope to see our students 50 and higher for percentile, but we also look at growth too. But I think that our NWEA data projects how students may score in New Hampshire SAS assessments. And so seeing a large cohort of students in the 41st to 99th percentile gives us confidence that things are going well, and that will translate into New Hampshire SAS.
so let me understand
results.
this.
Yeah.
One more time. If I'm looking at the percentile of 41 to 60 percentile.
Yep.
That tells me that we had, let's say for grade 1, we had 20 students that fell in that range.
Mhm.
And that range is the 41 to 60 percentile of everyone who took that exam. Statewide or,
National, so the
National.
percentile rankings are
Okay.
national. They're
okay,
national
so I would be
rankings.
including
I mean, it's a wide.
yeah, I mean,
group of
but if
schools
I
that
look at,
take
if I were to
NWEA
narrow that down to New England,
Mhm.
being 41 to 60 in New England means a lot more than being 41 to 60 nationwide.
Mhm.
Correct? Because nationwide includes southern states.
Right,
Okay.
Yeah.
So all right.
right. So standards, mathematically, they've developed this so that if you were pure average nationwide, you would have 60% of your learners in those top 3 areas.
And the norms have recently been updated. These are the 2022 norms that they've taken the data they have, they've normed it for 2022. They redo the norms every, I want to say like 2 to 3 years. And then, so these are the most updated norms. I think before that it was 2018, then 2015. But this sets a stage for us. It looks, the data is positive in that many of our students are considered average, high average, or in the high percentile on their first and second grade spring NWA. And again, this is district-wide, JGS and RMS combined.
So again, we broke out the schools into these pie charts. So this is kind of the opposite of that third grade look. It's like, what happened with first grade at JGS this year? That's not the percentage we'd want to see there. So again, it's a discussion point. What did we do? What, how does this make us rethink various things, many curricular things? And then the next one shows second grade.
The one component of second grade data that I think is noteworthy too is the way that the MAPS NWEA assessment is presented, is that there are 2 assessments that second graders can take. And so there's a K-2 assessment and a 2 through 5 assessment. So second graders could fall into either of those 2 assessments. And it's really determined by, or it can be determined by how a student scores on a previous assessment. So you would look at the first time they take the assessment in second grade in the fall, you would look at their spring score to determine which is the most appropriate assessment for them to take. Should they take the K-2 or should they take the 2-5? And those scores are pretty rigorous. So we're looking for students to really show a high level of proficiency with the items that they're being asked to do, to be able to do the 2-5. But the nice thing, but we still get their data back in terms of their percentile for being a second grade. But some of the students in the second grade cohorts, some took the the K-2, some took the 2-5, whichever is the better match for them at the time of them taking their test.
Can we go back to grade 1 for a minute? All right, am I reading this correct? That if I look at JGS, I'm looking at between 51 and 80, we're looking at roughly 25%. And if I look at RMS, between 51 and 80, I'm looking at something like 54, 55%.
Yeah.
Which is exactly the opposite.
Opposite of what we saw in third grade. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Which I think was Susan's point about so this is a slide that we really like to look at for JGS. And this is a slide that maybe we really like to look at for RMS. And so
Right.
I think the nice thing is that we clearly have some strengths, some very strong strengths in pockets. And so how do we share that out? How do we get, the great things that are happening at
So as this
JGS?
cohort goes through, we should take a look at how it changes relative to JGS.
Yeah.
And see what we're doing in it. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We go to slide 11. There we go. So just observations of data that we would state as positives. Although there was some discrepancy, really, both schools were doing well in grade 3 ELA in comparison to the state benchmark, at least what was the state benchmark in 2021. So we'll see, did that shift significantly this year or not? When we looked at New Hampshire SAS, that year-to-year growth for cohort groups, there are 4 opportunities for that for each school, and 3 out of the 4 showed growth. So that is a positive. And then the last 2 comments are about the NWEA. So again, as I said earlier, if we're saying, well, nationwide 60%, although there were still some discrepancies there in first, more so in first, we're still at or above the nationwide average on that. And then our goals. So certainly, as I mentioned earlier, the curriculum factors. So each grade level team, both in individual schools and as cross-school groups, really analyzing what are the curriculum factors that impacted their proficiency levels, whether those were proficiency levels we're excited about or not, either way. And that analysis needs to inform decisions about the resources, your scope and sequence, your pacing, and instructional strategies. We spent time as cross-school groups last year using the New Hampshire Language Arts Model Competencies, and those are important to make sure we're on target with enough rigor. Are we really clear about what our non-negotiables or power standards, whatever you want to call them, for the grade level are? In both of those, to make both of those happen, you have your continued work in PLCs, continued work with common assessments, strategies for being responsive to what you discover in the data, and looking at our professional development. Understanding, we've spent a lot of time in recent years working more on math and less on language arts. So coming back to, does everybody have a clear common understanding of what are the factors in the cognitive factors in comprehension? Are we implementing our chosen phonics program with Fidelity. And then what are instructional strategies that we want to see used across the board because they have are effective and powerful in our work with students. So our core ELA resource we have had for quite a while now. I don't even remember the year that we adopted it, but I think we've been through 2 math programs, or we're on our 2nd math program since we did our ELA adoption. So it is time for us to make sure we're looking back at research, what's out there now that meets high standards of rigor, and with the potential anyway of coming back to you and saying we think we should pilot some new resources.
I think that our PLCs this past year have spent a lot of time focusing on data and looking at numbers for common assessments, formative assessments, tools that they're using in the classroom to measure student growth. And a lot of time has been spent grouping and regrouping students and thinking about content. So as Susan said, that next layer that we want to make sure that we're really spending a lot of time on, not just for ELA, but all of our content instruction, is the how we teach is just as important as what we teach. And so making sure that the instructional approaches and the strategies that teachers are using to engage children in learning in the classroom are those that we know equal results in student learning. And so really, we added a couple of examples, just thinking about like learner discourse, problem-based instruction, movement, graphic organizers, making sure that those pieces are part of our everyday instruction in the classroom, because we know it has, through research, such a significant impact on student success.
You know the students.
Mhm.
Do you believe that these results reflect the actual knowledge of the students?
Any assessment is, of course, one data point. Sometimes an individual teacher will look at class list afterwards and be surprised in a pleasant way, or be surprised in oh, I'm so I really thought they were doing better than that. So I think that is an important role of PLCs, to take this and not act on it solely in isolation, but act on it in conjunction with their own formative assessments or other grade level data that they have.
I would say if you look at it from a higher level view, I would say, I think the overall data is probably an accurate or more closely accurate picture of where our learners are post-COVID. I think if we had not had the last couple of years that we have had, I think our data would look differently. But I think it is, when I look at the data, it doesn't jump out to me as being so off base or so either high or low. So I would say, and I think that's why we've chosen to look at it kind of big picture, because I think it does reflect sort of where our learners are post. Are we post COVID?
Yeah,
Are we post
of
pandemic?
course.
Well, we say it is, it's true, right? So I think that, when we think about that cohort in 3rd grade at JGS, I would say that those results mimic what we're seeing in class with the way that students are working and learning. And I would say that that is true also in 1st grade at RMS. So can you only pick out the parts you like? No, but I think that I would feel confident relying on the data to inform what happens next. And then we do the same thing for math. So the slides reflect, they're laid out in exactly the same way as our ELA slides. So we're back to 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders thinking about mathematics. And so showing our overall number of students who are proficient in math. Again, that strong group in third grade. It was consistent, not just for ELA, but also for math. And then kind of see a slide as we've gone down a little bit. So from 60% in third grade to 49 to 41 in fifth grade, which is not
what we would want.
not what we would want to see. I think the great thing about the JGS slide right here is that there is no below proficient triangle there in math, which is really exceptional. The approaching is really small. So here, there were actually 96% of students at JGS in third grade.
I think 86.
86, sorry, because 100 minus 14 is not 96. 86% of students were proficient or above on their New Hampshire SAS, which is like that's something that we shout from the rooftops. That's incredible results. So really great success. And then we can see, so again, grade 4 at JGS is still having stronger results with just over 50% scoring proficient or above, slightly less, around 45% at RMS. But then the breakdown of below proficient is pretty similar between the two, close to about 20% in each grade. And then in fifth grade,
There's opposites.
yeah.
So, so again, this is an area we look at. I suspect, for example, pacing might be a question I ask about in fifth grade as you get into the upper elementary schools. And it gets more challenging to really get into all of the content that you need to get into. So that's one question I'll be asking and working with the group to explore.
And I think a similar conversation. While the grade 5 results at RMS, there's more orange there, and they're not really where we want to see them as we think about students moving into sixth grade and those basic numeracy skills and making sure they're in place for students to be successful in much more rigorous content in the middle and high school.
So the next slide is again, looking at the left-hand side, those were New Hampshire as a whole, our proficiencies in spring 2021. So I would say as a whole in the state, we're not where we would want to be with proficiency levels, especially at that fifth grade level. Looking over at the charts on the right, again, reading left to right, you see what did a particular grade level do. And again, there are some nice examples of a grade level making some great improvement, others not so much. And then the green and the yellow are longitudinal with a particular cohort.
Just like our NWA for ELA, back to first and second graders, again, this paints a stronger picture of our students coming in to get ready for New Hampshire SAS. A significant group of students, pretty level, which was kind of interesting too, that are first and second graders, many of them are at that 41st percentile or higher. So hopefully setting the stage for good things to come with New Hampshire SAS. Interesting to see what happened to the color. We have a color change. But pretty similar when we look across the two grade levels for math. In fact, really similar results.
I know at one point I looked and said, oh, you didn't change, you put both numbers.
Yeah,
She's like, no, they are the same.
And the horizons is slightly different. But
And then second grade is next. And again, I think this was the one I looked at and said, wait a minute, did you change?
Yeah, so again, really, really similar, which is while we would love to see our students performing with a higher rate of proficiency, maybe. I think this goes to some of the work that we've really been doing where first graders and second graders now for the past 2 years have had a more consistent access to curriculum. So we've been using the Zern program as our primary tool. And so these are students who have had all of their math instruction from first and second grade using Zern entirely. And so we're seeing more consistent results between the two schools, which I think is a strength. Students are, I would infer from this that students are receiving, when we think about pacing and content, they're receiving pretty equitable and consistent access to content and level of instruction. And so therefore we're seeing pretty consistent results between the two different cohorts, the two different schools.
They're good results too.
Yeah.
So again, observations of data that are positives. Within New Hampshire SAS, we have some grade level proficiencies that this year are exceeding what the 2021 statewide levels were. We're not sure where the statewide levels are going in 2022, but hopefully will again look favorable. So that was, they exceeded them in 4 cohort groups, and then we're in the same range with 2 cohort groups. Over the years, as I've gone to workshops with the DOE, they really say, look at, if you're seeing a gap of 2-3 points, it's probably not significant. You know, look at 5 or certainly 10. Those are becoming more significant. So, and then of those younger students taking the MAP testing, 79% of first graders were in the average range or above, and 70% of second graders. So those are, as we were saying, stronger scores in comparison to what the older, or what they actually they were doing in language arts.
Yeah.
And so our goals, you'll notice, look very similar because it's the same basic structure in both curricular areas. So looking at the curriculum, looking at model competencies, using the power of PLCs, looking at professional development with some, of course, different twists to it there, and in what the highly effective instructional strategies would be and so on.
I think the one piece that is different, we talked about looking maybe at different core or newer updated core resources for ELA. We're not in the place that we're looking to do that for math right now because we just did that a couple of years ago, but continuing to look at our math instruction. I think kind of going back to the third small bullet where it talks about evidence-based, highly effective instructional strategies, and as well looking at our pacing and scope and sequence to making sure that that we're making good progress through curriculum as the year goes on, and not stalling or spending time kind of stuck on one concept before being able to move on. You know, if you spend a lot of time in one area in math, the other areas really do suffer as a result. ELA, reading and writing, is a little bit more, the skills can be a little bit more generalizable or applicable to other areas. But if you don't do measurement and data, that's a really big deal, not only for their growth in that one year, but their ability to be successful later on. So we want to make sure that our scope and sequence and pacing is on target to help them be successful within the grade and above.
And in the first bullet point, actually, of the PD, jumping back to that, the manipulatives, pictorial representations, making sure that we're not losing some of the work that we had done over the years with Mahesh Sharma, and so that we're integrating things that we know work with the Zern program and not jumping to too much independent work online, for example, versus your direct instruction.
Kind of taking an and approach instead of an or approach. So instead of, a lot of times when you start working with a new tool, teachers will say, well, I'm going to stop doing this and now I'm going to do this. And the question comes out, well, do I do what I used to do? Or do I do what I know now? And oftentimes it's an and. You take the best parts of what you used to do, the really great stuff from what you used to do, and you couple it with the new research and the new methods and the new tool, and you bring that together as an and instead of an or.
So that is our presentation.
All 22 slides of them.
Kim, I do have another paper copy if you would like that. It's not in color, sorry. Our rail store
That's all right.
Oh, do you want the color?
No, I like the numbers.
I know you do. I like the colors, thank you.
All right. So there's some good messages in here.
Mhm.
And I'm anxious to see what we see next year. Because a lot of 21 and before, like you say, is pandemic stuff. It's apples to oranges when you try to compare.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
And we're excited to share this out with our staff
Mhm.
and, have those discussions. I think over the course of the pandemic, first of all, we had no spring assessment one year, and then, we've kind of gotten away from that whole school look at things. So getting back to that is something that's useful and important to do.
Yeah, it'll be interesting if you can provide any causal information relative to the 4th grade, 5th grade math cohort.
Mhm.
It went from 34% in 21 to 32% in 22, which is consistent.
Mhm.
And it would be interesting what's happening with that cohort.
Yeah. Here's now.
Drum roll,
Now we'd
David,
be
drum
happy to
roll.
talk.
Great segue. So if there's no other questions, we'll jump in with the middle high school stuff.
Okay.
And we have more than 22 slides because we have a lot of other data that we wanted to share in context as well with some of our academic reporting for the year. I would sum up the year by saying, before we even really look at the data, that it was definitely a year of challenges across, I think, every school, but certainly in the middle high school. And we'll provide, some data to sort of show what I mean. And despite that, I will say I am pleased that our school has continued to find avenues to make growth. And in the academic data we present, you'll see, again, some areas that really stand out that we'll continue to capitalize on. First, I wanted to just give some positives because some of the data is tough to look at. So starting off with some things that went really well this year and represented some really nice cultural bounce backs that I think are good to capitalize on over the next few years. Our career day was finally able to come back this year after a couple of year hiatus. And we had over 50 different presenters come in this year. We had a college career sort of fair set up that basically the entire middle school came through, as well as most of the high school. Well, I think we had 24 presenters just in that space. And we had 6th and 7th and 8th graders going up and getting excited about post-secondary options and grabbing swag, but also walking away with lots of questions that they had asked the individuals there, as well as the classroom offerings that went really well. Our I Am College Bound Day this year was extremely successful. We had a lot of seniors supporting each other to sign college applications when those seniors hadn't believed they were likely to do that. And many of those learners went on to actually go to college for their upcoming school year choice. And so higher attendance at that this year than in the past, and more learners completing the applications that day who weren't going to. Our dances came back this year. We had 3 of them in the middle school. I think Kim was at one of them in the fall that I recall was chaperoning. Yeah, that one had about 260 learners at that middle school dance, which is most of the vast majority of the school population. And the two others also had well over 200 learners there, and they did wonderfully. It was a great experience having all of them back and just kind of having fun and enjoying being at school. We will celebrate that in most areas. We made some gains on our assessment scores this year, despite the post-COVID kind of world and some of the other challenges we'll highlight in the next few slides. We did a lot of expanding of our course offerings this year to meet learner interest and needs. And in the coming year, that's continuing with some new science electives, and our expanded art and STEM classes were very well received this year. We would like to continue to celebrate the partnership with FPU. This year we had another student teacher who has ended up being hired as a full teacher. That's the second year in a row that we've had that happen, which has been great. And we had a lot of other FPU students here in the building helping out throughout the course of the year. And we started off the very first foundations of a comprehensive school counseling program this year that we have lacked for quite some time. And again, that started to have an impact on some of the culture and climate in the building. So lots of things that we want to start off with that are positives before we jump into some of the harder data. We wanted to start with just a view of some of the behavior challenges that existed in the school this year. It was a tough year for managing learner behavior. This chart shows the combined middle high schools office referrals, and these totals only include those items which were formally brought to administration for investigation and resolution. So you can see that we had done a lot of work pre-COVID, bringing the numbers down, and had been on a very good trajectory. And last year, even though the number is lower than the prior year, it was a little bit concerning having even the 442 in the 2021 school year. We had about 200 less individuals inside the school building during that year due to learners doing alternative schooling or remote learning, but our numbers were still relatively high. But this year, as everyone has come back into the building and our numbers are back to about 700, you can see the dramatic increase in behaviors that were referred to the office for support. And that 1,487 number, that's a substantial drain on time and resources, but also a substantial cry for help for the learners who needed that support. And it was a pretty dramatic increase this year.
That across the board schools in general.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. We're going to dig a lot deeper into some of what that looks like and some of the data points behind that. I will say that despite the high number, we did not have any substantial incidents that required major law enforcement presence here. We were not having the police called for fights and things like that, which a lot of area schools had. We didn't have things like walkouts take place, which again, were pretty common in a lot of other buildings. And that's, I think, because of the climate that we work to create with our staff, as well as the interventions that we tried to put in place to support some of those behaviors. But it was definitely, that number alone is already quite jarring when you look at where a lot of the resources went this year. So then we just break out a little more specifically into the middle school. Unfortunately, the middle school, again, has been on kind of an upward trend over the last 2 years. Pretty dramatic this year with about, more than twice the referrals of the previous year. And so then we drill a little bit deeper into the middle school. This is literally just looking at grade level. So this is not a cohort following, but you can kind of see a trend in the 18-19 school year. 7th grade kind of stood out that year, needing a lot more of that behavioral support. That kind of stays consistent with them at or near the top, but this year by far was the most challenging grade level. And I think there's obvious reasons for that. The 7th grade group this year experienced in the 2021 school year when they would have been in 6th grade, about 25 of those current 7th graders in their 6th grade year were fully remote. So they never came into the school building. They never had their transition meeting the learners from other towns. Another 20 or so were not enrolled in our school in their 6th grade year at all and came back this year. So we had, between 40 and 50 learners who completely missed that 6th grade transition. And the first time they were in the middle school building and experiencing learners from other towns was this 7th grade year. And that was also our largest class by far at 115 learners this year. We had a lot of challenge with those peer conflict sort of social pieces that normally would be resolved much more in the 6th grade. And then we look at the high school. The high school had been on a very good sort of downward trajectory. Again, we invested a lot of different structures and processes over the 18-19 and 19-20 school years. And obviously with COVID, that sort of undid, quite a bit of that work. And as everyone came back into the building and we went from having about, 250 consistent learners in the building back up to close to 400 this year, we had a substantial increase in behaviors this year in the high school. More than half of that 794 total was grade 9, which you'll see in a couple of slides. And again, a critical transition year, the first year with them being back in person being that year, kind of makes sense that we had so many of those challenges. So again, you kind of look at the grade levels each year. This is not following cohorts, but just the actual grade level. And you can see that the trends are all the same. 12th grade, which is consistently the blue column, as it should be, is often the lowest. 9th grade is often at or near the highest. Sometimes you have 11th grade popping out like you did in the 18-19 school year and again this year. But everything this year obviously was just a much more substantial jump up in those behavioral needs. And this graph starts to follow some of our cohort groups. So now if you look at the bottom, you can see the colors that correspond with school years, and then the class is showing up above. So if you look, sort of the class of 2023 was on a downward trend by the 20 school year, and then all of a sudden jumps up this year with that yellow bar. The class of 25, jumps up again this year. So you can kind of, again, this one is following the same group from year to year. And you can literally see in some cases, like with the class of 2022, progress literally being undone with some of the supports that have been in place with the referrals that we managed this year. Just another way of looking at it, each line is a school year and the classes are sort of at the bottom. And again, you can see this year sort of jumping out for all of the cohorts. And then just even a little bit deeper in with these specific cohort groups, again, the class of 22, you have some substantial improvement over time of their behaviors, and then this year a spike back up. Whoops, I don't know what this, I think these are some of your slides.
So segue into, we'll go back down to 6th grade. I think this is one of our big highlights, actually, is beginning of 6th grade. Huge transitions. It was a little bumpy at first, but then, the 6th grade team and all of us were just really excited to see that they found their sort of path. They were able to really use some of the skills with their teaching their team about how to manage being back in the building with everybody. So it was great. I think this was probably one of the highlights of the year, I think. So.
What this chart, you'll see several of these now. These just literally show the amount of referrals that were received in the office per school day. And this is specifically zoomed in on grade 6. So there's no numbers with this chart. It's literally just capturing a trend.
And then 7th grade, you'll see like the reverse. And I think the 7th grade is when you break this out, there were a lot of things at the beginning of the year. Things kind of, they seem to figure things out, but then it was pretty rough. That peak is March, and fairly typical. I think March across the board in schools is usually March Madness, I guess I'll call it. So
The other interesting piece is those dips that take place, like the one, about a third of the way past September. That each of those dips represents a time when the school counseling team and Rachel came up with interventions in the classrooms. And one of those was, for example, pulling together specific social groups with one of our school counselors, and they started meeting regularly to try to resolve some of these peer conflicts. And then you see a dip, and then things start to be loosened back out a little bit. They start returning back to sort of normal school stuff out in the playground and things like that. And you start to get a little peak up again. And then the school counselors go into the classrooms and do some specific training. It starts to come down. And then, so that a lot of those dips represent specific points in time when lots of learning opportunities and things like that were being implemented specifically in grade 7.
8th grade, started off a little bit rocky, but then again, similar to the nice example of 6th graders, they figured out where things are. They were able to, really focus and buckle down. Their social peer interactions improved greatly because I think they had more experience working together. So it was a nice trend. 9th grade was the most referrals we had at any class, and you can see it was consistently increased over the year. And of that, the number of referrals, there were probably about a handful that make up the vast majority of referrals. So, I mean, if you look, there's probably about 5 kids that are ninth graders that were consistent customers of ours in my office. So, and many of those kids have outside resources and you know, hopefully we're gonna make some gains over the summertime. And 10th grade, you know, beginning of the school year, you can see where it's just a difficult transition coming in. And our 10th graders, I think, did some, you know, quite a bit of figure out who they are as a person, you know, buckling down to where I want to go by the time I, you know, get out of high school. 11th grade, there was a couple of learners that really had struggled with some social emotional issues, you know, put some interventions in, and that's when the curve started going down. And then a peak was about March-ish, was the winter time. And then 12th graders, you know, again, you're looking at those statistics and, you know, they're halfway out the door. So they know that they've got to buckle down. They got to get ready for whether it's going to be, you know, continuing going on to college or work or the service. You know, I rarely saw that. So I think we jump back to.
So then just a couple more cohorts that kind of stand out with some unique pieces. This is this current year's junior class. And again, just to show the impact and the difference that 1 year has made, this group went from 31 issues that required some support last year from administration beyond just the teacher capacity to support to almost 200 this year. And, you know, that same pattern with the class of 2024, substantial drop and then back up again. And then the freshman class this year, which is in that pivotal transition year this year, coming back, many of them for the first time in a year and a half, just a substantial increase in what we were supporting for behavior. So then we kind of stripped away, you know, some of the pieces in there that maybe aren't as impactful to the school environment and focus on what we would categorize as kind of those major categories of behavior support. And you can just take a look here, you know, you can see again, that yellow line is the current school year, consistently jumping dramatically above prior school years. In some cases, as we look closer at the middle school versus the high school data, it's kind of a reset back to where we were in 18-19 before a lot of our supports and processes were in place for this year. In other cases, it's just a dramatic pickup of behaviors that we really hadn't seen in quite some time. And if you look specifically at that theft and vandalism category, this is just a middle school actually, you know, we had 30 situations this year where individuals in the middle school were responsible for vandalism. Some of that was a TikTok trend early in the year. And we had things like soap containers being taken off of walls, door rings being removed, nothing serious in our building because again, we were able to intervene relatively quickly and our processes for support were there. But nonetheless, those are things that we're not used to having here. We had, you know, some incidences of things being taken out of classrooms, unfortunately, that had to be addressed. So just behaviors that again, are not typical in our school environment, but we saw a dramatic increase as everyone came back together this year. And you can see our peer conflict numbers on the right, which is a little bit different from that sort of, and we'll talk about the violent behavior category in a second, but peer conflict is literally that verbal sort of exchange of negativity that can get in the way of classrooms being effective, most of that being in the 7th grade, a big uptick in that behavior this year, but there's even a notable uptick in that behavior in the previous year that again required some support. The violent behavior category, it's not like those are people who are threatening the school or causing substantial harm to others. The vast majority of that in the middle school was violent behavior reported as an individual entering a classroom and throwing something, you know, claiming that they did it to be funny, but then of course it hits somebody and upsets them and creates a situation. That I would say that accounts for probably 2/3 of that category. And, you know, I think maybe 2 of those in the middle school this year were actual physical altercations. Again, more than we're used to having in the middle school. Some of those are situations of threats that were made, again, in that vein of peer conflict, but perhaps a bit beyond that. So those are pretty substantial behaviors that increased, you know, quite a bit as learners came back into the building, again, mostly isolated to that 7th grade year. And then you can see the categories of disruption in the classroom, you know, substantially up this year. disrespect of individuals in the classroom, things like that. Yep, my next slide. Unfortunately, that these increases in behaviors translated into a notable increase in suspended learners. And that is never something that we want to be celebrating or think is a great thing to have in place. This is not 76 learners that have been suspended. This is 76 incidents that resulted in an out-of-school suspension of any length of time for a learner. And when you look back at the previous data and you have, again, 52 instances of somebody being aggressive, throwing things and causing harm, things like that, 44 instances of peer conflict, 30 of theft. Those are the types of things that often result in sometimes just a half of a day of out-of-school suspension, but it's notable and it's impactful to learning and it's impactful to our ability to work with learners. And when you look at the in-school suspension total in the middle school, again, more ability to work with learners on in-school suspension more immediately to resolve and provide reflection and support. So that number is something that I think would be expected with these high levels, but something that we would like to see curtailed for the right reasons, meaning that we're continuing to improve our strategies for intervention and support. And then just jumping into the high school quickly for that drill down of data, nothing that's dramatically different. You know, the peer conflict numbers are much higher than we're used to having them. Those same category of, you know, threats towards peers, harassment of peers, which would fall into that violent behavior, back to 2018-19 levels. The defiance in classrooms up this year, disruption up this year, et cetera. So a little bit less substantial of increases in the high school, which I think is reflective of the fact that they have had less time at the higher grades disrupted by the last couple of years, but still a notable increase in most of these major categories. And that corresponds again to the same sort of jump in learners who were on out of school and on the next slide in school suspension. The 18-19 school year was a year of a lot of transition. And if we were to continue going back even before that, you know, the data was high in a lot of these categories for quite a while. We invested a lot of time and resources as a school in the 18-19 and 19-20 school year. We completely revised our approach to discipline in those two school years, began to do more work with specifically finding support processes, creating support teams, doing learning. We created our discipline handbook at the end of that 2020 school year, which, as an interesting side note, the state is currently doing a project to create basically a bias and discipline handbook to give to schools, and recognize that they combed every school's website and pulled our discipline handbook, met with 55 schools, but said that ours was the one that they were pulling most of the pieces out of because they felt like its practices and processes and philosophy aligned with what they were looking for the state. So the work we did there produced a lot of reduction in behaviors and suspension, but unfortunately the whole system was completely overwhelmed this year with, you know, what we experienced. Correct. Yeah, I mean, that shows up for sure in that. I mean, the 1920 data, you know, we had 3 months, and as you saw previously, the end of the school year for most grades peaks way down. So that data is still pretty solid. The 2021 data, you know, we were remote for good chunks of that school year. So we'll just, the next few slides are combined, or the next one slide. So we'll just jump right over that. It's literally the middle high school combined, but doesn't show anything we haven't talked about. The last thing we wanted to sort of frame in context before we jump into some of our academic data is the habitual truancy numbers. JRMS is very interesting with the habitual truancy. You know, we're down to a level where this number of students on the left. So we have this year about 40 learners who were habitually truant, which is 10 or more half days. 2021, a lot of schools with remote learning experienced a huge jump because engaging learners remotely was very difficult. But you know, we're kind of back to where we were in 1920, which is moving in a good direction of finding ways to engage those families and keep the learners here in school. The high school has unfortunately, you know, it's down from where it was, and certainly down from 18-19, which again was a longer pattern of concern. But we were at a bit of a plateau. And I think that, you know, one of our goals this upcoming school year, we've already done some revisions internally to how we're going to be communicating and closing the loop and the high school with truancy, concerns, to hopefully bring those families and learners to the table even sooner and try to bring those numbers down with better support systems. And now this is just an overall picture for the whole school. You can see again, beginning of the year, wow, everyone's back, and holy moly, they've forgotten how to be here. We put a lot of things in place, brought some of those pieces down, and then we had a second, almost like a second wind of support needs in the second part of the year that kind of plateaued as we came towards the end of the year. And then the next one is just another way of looking at how things began to shift. Minor incidents are ones that teachers manage, but report just for the sake of documenting. Those were quite high this year as well. But you can almost, if you look at the previous, graph, if you can click back for 1 second, it's almost like the inverse. Teachers did what they could at the beginning of the year, and then things just continued to shift more and more into the administrative and counseling sort of realm. And I just think this is interesting, looking at the days of the week and the times. I'm not sure what value comes of this yet, because we did not have educators handbook in the previous years in the middle high school. So we don't have some of this to compare with, but right now, every day of the week is tough this year. There is no pattern to that, but there are some times of the day where at least you can kind of say what's going on in there and do some support.
But some kids don't show up on Friday.
That is true. That might be the slight downtick there on Friday. So.
You will notice on the right, the hours is, there's a common, theme of leading up to lunch and then right after lunch. I think that was a common theme of, kids building up whatever type of issues that are going on, and then lunchtime, I don't know, it's always interesting at lunchtime, I'll say that.
So some key takeaways, just on this climate and behavior side of things, our behavioral situations, which we only can measure with data through office referrals, that we know there are other things that are resolved and handled that aren't a part of this data, I'm sure, but we have enough here to know that the office referrals this year that required support beyond the classroom were substantially higher than we've seen, at least over the last 2 to 3 years, and in many cases matching or exceeding the 2018-19 school year, which was completely a COVID-free year. The major parts of those behaviors also were dramatically increased, and we specifically saw that with our 7th and 9th grade, with the most dramatic increases, due again to those lost transition opportunities that even though we did our best with continuing to find avenues to bring them on board, it just wasn't the same as having all of our 6th graders together, meeting each other in the building in a safe way, learning the norms. They kind of, were doing that in 7th grade, and it was not as successful as it would have been. We know that COVID has heavily impacted the social and community regulation skills of our learners, not so much at the upper grades, but definitely in those middle years, where we have a lot of investment of time and resources we're going to need to do to continue to support those learners. And we've already, as a reflection on this, coming into this year, had shifted a lot of support systems and are continuing to do even more of that, including some staff shifts to try to address some of that in the upcoming school year. So in many ways, we're back to or further behind in the social skills, unfortunately, than we were a few years ago. And that's just the reality that we're kind of working with. Specific action plan that we're kind of putting in place. Again, we've already shifted some resources to the social and emotional side of our school. We took some of the reactive parts of our discipline and support processes and instead have shifted those to some more proactive positions. We've added a school transition counselor to this upcoming school year and added another school counselor focused exclusively on 6th and 7th grade, because our needs have shifted so dramatically back to that building up of skills and building up of support. We've added a specific support period to the upcoming 6th grade. That's kind of an RTI period, but also just a generalized check-in and making sure that 6th graders have what they need. We know that that's going to be important to continue to support that growth in 7th grade. Our school counseling program, which started the very foundational pieces of a comprehensive counseling program, has already begun to create specific learning progressions in the district sort of model of instruction, which includes can-do statements and specific times and activities to bring across our entire school to continue developing many of those skills. We've begun to identify and create a schedule of learning opportunities, some of them school-wide with the bringing in of speakers and things like that, Others directed specifically at faculty to arm them with a toolkit and specific resources that they can use in their classroom. Obviously, many of these will be learner-specific resources, and we're planning a dramatic increase in opportunities for parents to come in and both learn and teach us ways to continue to be proactive and support more positive community norms. We've spent a lot of time this summer reviewing our sort of operational systems to build better efficiency. We need to find ways to move more of our support and discipline programming back to that reflective learning and closed loop model versus the reactive situation that we were sort of forced into this year. And an example of that is identifying ways to create more of the peer conflict challenge resolution through counseling, so we're not using our behavior systems to address peer conflict and skill building opportunities. Another example is providing some specific training to teachers and ongoing support throughout the year so that they feel more confident managing those classroom behaviors without resorting to those escalating into an office referral and others. We've also digitized our learner reporting system, which will be rolling out in the fall, so that learners can give us information more quickly and in a safer way for them, and allow us to more quickly resolve some of those pieces before they rise to a behavior challenge in the classroom. And with Heather Lindstad's sort of leadership, the link in 9th grade and web in 8th grade, link in 11th and 12th and web in 8th grade are specific, concrete, structured mentoring programs, which we believe will help to continue to grow positive ways of peers to support each other as time goes on. So that's the context of where we're at with our school culture and behavior. And again, a lot of work was done this year and a lot of time put into those types of supports. So now we'll get into the academic side of things.
We were very fortunate to be able to add an additional position in our 6th grade team. So we have a dedicated reading teacher and a dedicated writing teacher. And we were so eager to see how this would be manifested in this data point. This is our SAS. It is the 6th grade results, not the same cohort, but 6th grade results over 5 years. We're missing the year for COVID. But the exciting part is that we noticed the gray from last year's 6th grade learners to this year's decreased dramatically to be gold. And that is the below proficient scoring. And conversely, at the other end of the graph here, our above proficient learners really multiplied. So it really did have an impact. So despite whatever behavioral challenges that are going on and adjusting to being in person as an entire school body, we're very pleased with our 6th grade ELA results. Lots more growth, but we're moving in the right direction. And we thank the community for supporting that additional literacy position. So now let's look at the same group of learners over some time. Congratulations to the elementary for their growth in many areas of ELA, and we only hope to be able to mimic that. We're comparing our current 6th graders from their performance during their 5th grade year and then this year on the NH SAS. We are thrilled that we did not lose ground. A historical trend, unfortunately, has been the learners tend to come to us in middle school strong, and slowly over time, the test scores seem to diminish somewhat. And we were thrilled that we were able to hold steady. Okay. That's that same data, just looking at the numbers. So our current 7th graders we made some growth, lost a little bit of ground, but this was our most challenging group by far, as David and Rich have said. But we still were able to make some growth.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about where our ELA numbers and math numbers in the middle school are going to consistently be, even where we've, in this case, you can literally see the chunk that went from proficient to approaching. We didn't make any, unfortunately, we didn't make any change in the numbers of learners from last year's 6th grade class who are below proficient as 7th graders. A small chunk went from proficient to approaching. But if you were to compare more across 7th grade historically, that grade level, the loss that we typically have in ELA from proficient and above shifting into approaching, or in many cases below, has been halted. And we have a very small shift there from proficient to approaching. So again, it's not the type of results we want to see. We want to see those ELA results consistently increasing in proficiency or above, but we've managed to arrest the decline and can, hopefully shift things into a better
Absolutely.
direction. And so
Absolutely.
the cohort to watch would be the current 6th grade group who has had that divided reading and writing instruction, doing less in each class, but going deeper, and see how that translates into the 7th grade as we look at our learning progressions in that grade level and sort of the scope and sequence moving forward.
There's the same data, just shown.
This is why we have 55 slides, by the way, because it's just like.
All right,
a lot of the
so
same
here's our
days.
current
Skip the
8th
numbers.
grade. They are coming to us as 9th graders. And you can take a look at the data here. The blue was before COVID, and then we have a little space. Again, same thing that happened in the previous slide. We grew in some areas, lost some ground in others. One thing that we are doing to try and arrest any loss that we have is we have completely revised our learning goals so that they are based on power standards to more closely align with the NWEA and the SAS standards, and solid teaching. Again, doing a little bit less, but going into much more depth and increasing the level of rigorous thinking.
So it appears to me that this is a single cohort, right?
Correct,
So the below proficient has increased.
correct,
Yes,
And approaching has increased.
correct. This cohort has lost ground each year.
Yep.
Yes.
There's no question about that.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yep, that's absolutely the case here.
Yep.
And again, it's not the result that we want to see, but what we took a look at this year was when we look at the 8th grade team and the proficient and above for 8th grade compared to 8th grade last year, the 8th grade team performed better in terms of supporting these learners. This group lost ground. And so we're still in a position here where we have not, we have a lot more work to do with that team. So there's the numbers that sort of back up what you're saying, Charlie. We don't have 6th grade results for this group. There was a lot of issues with the SAS 2020 data. And so some cohorts have it and some don't. But you can see that this group entered the middle school with 60% at level 3 or above and is leaving the middle school with 28% at level 3 or
Right.
above. And that's a substantial problem.
right. We are very, very concerned, and we're going to be digging down and spend our PLC time. As the elementary schools shared, we really need to look at what our instructional practices are, what our curriculum material is, and look at our learners differently, because they are completely different. But we definitely own this and have to work on it. Okay, let's go to math. So this is the same cohort following from the 5th grade year, and then our COVID year.
Oh, it's 3rd grade,
Oh, nope,
COVID,
3rd,
5th
4th,
grade,
5th,
6th grade.
Sorry. Yep,
So again, the positive part of this, not the data that we would like to see. We would like to
Mhm.
see those completely reversed so that the blue and the green are what are currently the orange and the red. But again, the loss between 5th grade and 6th grade here was substantially lower than it was the previous year. The 6th grade teacher, who was in her 2nd year teaching, along with the rest of the middle school math team, did a lot of work identifying the specific learning progressions and reviewing the New Hampshire SAS standards that were being assessed through that, filling holes, adjusting, and then using a 1 to 4 grading system to better align classroom assessment and reporting with what would be on the SAS. And so what we see here is, yes, some ground is lost, but substantially less than the current 7th graders had lost when they came into 6th grade. So again, it's hard to paint that picture with these graphs, but that's where we're at right now, is looking at where our efforts are successfully slowing or stopping the loss of ground versus where they're improving instruction, you know, for
So can I
learners.
ask a question about SAS?
Yep,
Does it get more difficult year after year?
yes. The benchmark goes up
So-
each year.
So the cohort, you know, going into the 6th grade exam would not be, take a more difficult exam than the prior year's 6th grade.
Correct. Correct.
Oh,
No, I
you're
think
saying,
you're saying, yeah,
yeah, I think I was answering differently than what you're asking.
Yeah.
The 6th grade test from one year to the next is not more difficult for the 6th graders.
Right.
So this year's 6th graders didn't take a more difficult 6th grade test than the
Yeah.
previous year's 6th graders.
Mhm.
The benchmark
However-
goes up in 7th grade, but not in 6th.
Right, and certainly from, in the elementary school, from 3rd grade, they're just covering,
Mhm, mhm.
so the rigor that the test is covering goes
Right.
up like this. So the
Right.
question we need to look at is, does our rigor go up like that, or does our rigor go up like that?
And as you said, the pacing, what are we missing? What
Right.
didn't we have time or what didn't we prioritize?
Mhm.
That has to really be looked at. So let's look at 7th grade. This is very exciting for us here. So 7th grade, a lot of our learners left the below proficient and moved into the approaching or proficient areas. Our above proficient, great job. Several of our learners, we are using several data points, including teacher recommendation. Several of these 7th grade above proficient learners will be invited to participate in a middle level taught Algebra 1 class. They've demonstrated that they have the ability to problem solve and attend to the rigor needed in a more accelerated math class.
So here you can kind of see on this chart, the 6th grade to 6th grade comparison I was referring to.
Mhm.
Last year, the 6th grade teacher with that class had 13% at level 3 or above. That was, you know, roughly doubled this current year. So not what we want to see in the big picture, but as a point in the journey, definitely a lot of growth with what the team and what she in particular had done to adjust this year.
Yeah. Some of these ups and downs are really gonna, to me anyway, it would be difficult for you to analyze
Yeah.
because there's so few data points.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's look at our current 8th graders, and we have a little bit more data. Go back to 5th grade and you can see how our above proficient, our proficient numbers, well, especially the above proficient really tends to drop by 8th grade. This is something we're also very much looking at.
Here's another example where, you know, we're strangely calling it a win because again, we did not lose ground. There's a slight uptick in the number of learners proficient. And in the past, this 8th grade year would have been, you know, there was one year where it didn't register because it was below 10% at level 3 or above. So anything that we capture here that shows that the work that the teachers are doing with their learners, despite the environment that we started off with, you know, we've managed to show some growth in some cases, arrest decline in other cases. In some cases, we still have some work to do, you know. And this was our biggest, I guess, area of concern with math. Typically, what we've seen in substantially prior years was that in the high school, there's been a lot of reversing of decline with math, and we've seen some uptick. And that simply has not been the case over the last couple of years. This is showing the current 11th graders with their PSAT 10 and the 2020 to 21 school year at 23%, meeting the benchmark or above. That dropped to 20% this year and remained at 20% on the SAT in the spring of this year as well. So we saw a reversal of math results, and then it sort of held steady there for an entire school year with the 11th graders. So this is another data point for some of our grades. For the first time, I would say, at least in my time in this school, we've done multiple testing sessions for every grade level using either New Hampshire SAS interim and then summative assessments in the middle school. And then with 8th grade and above, various different iterations of the SAT, which were administered in the fall, and then again in the spring to see, again, measure growth and provide data to our teams coming into the school year. So this is the 8th grade results from this fall. You can see that under the English sort of section, that's evidence-based reading and writing is what ERW stands for. 48% of the 8th graders met the benchmark in the fall session of testing. And with the math benchmark, 26% met the benchmark. But if you jump to the next slide, which is the spring results, by that point, 73% were meeting the benchmark on the SAT, or in this case, the PSAT 8-9, and 39% were meeting the benchmark in math. So this is interesting because this is another, standardized assessment that is well regarded. And on this assessment, our learners have grown substantially over the course of the year, whereas on New Hampshire SAS, that growth was much more muted in both reading and in math.
And there are the state data is there.
The state data for this one is the third column, and the entire country data is at the bottom. So we were slightly performing below the state in evidence-based reading and math, and basically on par with the nation with this test with math, and very much above the nation with this test on evidence-based reading and writing. The 9th graders also take the PSAT 8-9. You can see their fall score here, 52%. Were at the MET level for evidence-based reading and writing in the fall. 21% were at the benchmark in math. And in the springtime testing session, a lot less growth than we saw. Whoops. Yeah, we can just hit the next one. So here's the spring, a little bit of growth in evidence-based reading and writing for 6%. Math was a bigger jump, 15% higher on that meeting the benchmark in the springtime session. A little bit more below the national average and the state average here, a lot more below the state average in math and reading.
But not too bad when you consider that, did you say, Rachel, half the data for the behavior were the 9th graders?
Yep.
So
391 of the 700 referrals were from this age group. And then our 10th graders take the PSAT 8-9 in the fall, and then the PSAT 10 in the spring. So on the PSAT 8-9 in the fall, our 10th graders had 76% were meeting the benchmark in evidence-based reading and writing and 48% in math. And then when they took the PSAT 10 in the spring, which is if you look at the benchmark scores, it's 410 in reading and writing and 450 in math. When you skip to the PSAT 10, which is the next slide, in the spring, the benchmarks jump. So it's the score of 430 is the benchmark in reading and 480 in math. Declines a little bit with the increased benchmark, a drop of about 5% in the reading writing category, still substantially above the national average with that one and a little bit above the state. Math had a pretty sharp drop from 48% meeting the benchmark in the fall down to 32%, meeting it with the higher benchmark in the spring. And then 11th grade, there's the fall PSAT results, 55% meeting the evidence-based reading and writing, 20% meeting math. And what's most concerning about the math is when you jump to the spring SAT, that middle approaching category in math, which was at 9%, drops to 1%, and all of those learners drop into the strength and skills category on the SAT. Whereas if you look at the evidence-based reading and writing, it was at 55% on the practice in the fall, 60% in the spring. So that tells us that some of our strategies with evidence-based reading and writing continue to support some growth in the 11th grade. Math is clearly another story. We don't yet have cohorts, obviously, but what we'll be doing over the coming years is continuing to follow the current 8th graders. Next year, we'll get 2 more data points on PSAT 8-9. So that will be really great to see over a 4 testing points span of time with an identical assessment, how they've continued to grow. And then, of course, the 10th graders will have another round of PSAT, several more times before they get, one more time before the SAT. So we'll have some more data points there as well. Definitely, we see COVID having an impact on proficiency across the board. That's, we don't dispute that. Some areas more than others, we've seen a decline. But despite the fact that we've had those huge increases in behavior, most of our cohorts had some level of growth that we could measure either on the PSATs or on the New Hampshire SAS or the SATs. Some of those data points consistently showed growth. And in other areas, we've at least managed to slow or stop the decline that would have been in place previous years. Something we weren't able to show here because the way that the science SAS is reported is very strange. But in last year, our science results in the middle school and the high school did not register. And if you look on our school report card, it just said less than 10%. So they couldn't even give us a score essentially. This year, those results were substantially higher. In JRMS, we had 25% of learners were in the advanced or proficient category and 31% in the high school. So they've invested, again, a lot of time into looking at those learning progressions in science. And we saw that paying off in 8th grade and 11th grade this year. The math performance in 6th and 7th grade improved. In 6th grade, we essentially stopped that 5th grade drop off for this group and were able to preserve most of what they came in with. And in 7th grade, that was actually reversed, and we saw some statistically meaningful growth from their 6th grade year. So that's a positive math point. However, math is a continued area that needs substantial growth in the middle school and the high school. And we'll talk a little bit on the next slide about what we're planning to do about that. And the last takeaway that we've been able to see is that ELA is generally a strength in the middle and high school, especially as measured on those 8th grade and above assessments. But we've seen in 6th grade that the writing program and the focus on developing writing as its own set of learning goals has had, again, a substantial impact on supporting the literacy of our 6th graders and preserving the strengths they come in with from 5th grade. And we've come up with some specific action areas already coming into this school year, again, to slow that decline in writing skills that we've seen coming through some of the ELA assessments. We've created a half-credit writing course that will be universal for all incoming 9th graders, kind of to mirror, but to a lesser extent, the success of those specific writing skills that will be essential in high school, mirroring what we did with the 6th graders for middle school. We're going to be shifting a larger spotlight to high school math, sort of mirroring what we did in the middle school, doing a review of the learning goals and comparing those to what's assessed and measured on the SATs, looking at our course offerings. Does the current traditional sequence of courses make sense for every learner? Will the data tell us that we're missing key areas where a different type of course might better serve those learners and things like that? And JRMS will continue what it started this year with that same work going into next year. Similar to elementary, we're really recognizing the importance of that PLC work. The 6th grade team was probably the strongest example of a strong data-driven PLC this year. And again, we saw the impact of that on how learners were able to get what they needed for instruction. We want to continue to invest in that and enhance all of our PLC teams' ability to recognize the types of data to collect, how to interpret that data, and what that can influence for instruction. We are, as we've said, shifting to an almost universal use of Otis and a 1-to-4 grading and reporting system next year, which, as we saw with most of our middle school math data, allowed the teachers to more accurately capture where learners were at on their learning goals, which in turn allowed them to direct more resources, intervention, and instruction to those specific standards. So we're excited to see how that works as we roll that out across the whole building. We are working this summer on better creating the resource for teachers to pull SAS, which is relatively easy to pull from, but more complicated is SAT. We're trying to create some data banks of questions, because part of what we did this year that was really successful in some of the areas of the middle school in particular was do more of using that SAS style or SAT style of questioning, use that more for warm-ups and practices, really to help ensure that we're reaching that level of rigor and learners are practicing more regularly how to do that. And then continuing to fully flesh out curriculum. It's one of our NEAS goals that we are going to have to do is have consistent, curriculum documents anyways, but that's work that Heather and the teachers have been doing for the last year really extensively. So we'll continue that work, fleshing out more of the can-do statements that can serve as important criteria steps for learners and teachers, building out more clearly the essential questions for each of our learning goals, and then continuing to build a bank of resources for instruction. So I guess the summary message is that we feel like we're on the right track in many areas. We need to get those behavior, learner support pieces, continue bringing that back down and focusing more resources on, efficiency with that and better support for learners there, but also continuing to work on the directions that we started doing the last couple of years. And COVID needs to go away and not come back.
Are you doing much relative to integrating math into non-math courses and ELA into math courses?
Specifically, our 6th grade math and science teachers have spent some professional development time with me, and they have built some integrated units that they're going to be rolling out next year. They dabbled with it a little bit this year, found tremendous success, and they're building on top of that. And there is some co-teaching that's going on as well. We need to move more in that direction. You're exactly right. We've increased our STEM offerings, which integrates math, of course, but you're right. We need to get out of the mindset that these are the walls we stay within and really integrate literacy, numeracy across the board. You're right.
So we would have math teachers providing feedback relative to writing.
Yes, because writing is evidence of what you're thinking. And in math, many times when you're trying to solve a problem going through the process, we can't see a learner's thinking. But if they can write down or tell us what they're thinking, that just solidifies. We can identify the problem, provide feedback. Writing needs to happen in the math classroom. I've got resources for that. That's a mind shift that we're going to have to address with the staff, but it has to be across the content, reading and writing everywhere.
One thing that we kind of learned in the process of Otis this past June, we had several sessions with an Otis trainer. Otis allows for the school to create banks of what they call locked assessments, but they're essentially assessments that you place into a folder and make accessible to whichever groups or grades or whatever you want to take that assessment. And everybody does that. So they can't adjust it, they can't change it. Different people can then score the assessment, and it becomes a universal tool for seeing across different grades or different content areas how that specific assessed item is playing out and how growth is taking place. The benefit of that is when you try to do, assessing across disciplines or things like that, or school-wide assessments in a more traditional sense, it's hard getting the resources out. It can be difficult making sure that there's fidelity to what this group uses versus this, but we're excited because this tool allows us to create, as on the admin side, what that bank of resources and assessed items looks like, and then assign it to everybody at the same time with consistency. And we're looking forward to seeing how that tool can support more of exactly what you said, pulling reading assessments into some of these other content areas, pulling math, which shouldn't just be in a math class. You can see in a social studies classroom, analysis of graphs and tables that can support understanding about geography or understanding economic principles. Those things should be happening too. And with this tool, you can build more of that in, across some of those different content areas.
Great.
That we had a lot of data, and I apologize. There was a lot that we.
Mine was going up before I even got in here, so I'm just trying to desperately focus.
So I think it's a lot of great information. It really is. And I think that there's a lot of progress being made. And in order to see progress from the data, you have to understand what you can do to make the progress happen.
Right.
And that's the biggest challenge. And I think you guys are getting there. So I'm really feel positive about the work that you're doing.
I would love to hear what your ELA group at RMS and your math group at JGS, I want to hear what those teachers did and maybe share some ideas with us with the tremendous success they've had.
Yeah, we do. We have a Teaching Tuesday model instead of a staff meeting, like every 4 or 5 staff meetings, people offer workshops. I'd love to see if we can have some of your teaching staff come in some of those areas maybe and provide some of that as a workshop. That'd be great.
That'd be awesome.
So were you planning on presenting a encapsulated version of this to the board?
I don't know if he's able to.
We certainly can.
We tried to hold them off with like
Take
30
did.
slides.
One
Like-
slide away.
Yeah.
We
I
did the
think that
best we could.
there's a lot of information here and a lot of information that the board would be interested in. You could just pick out the key elements, you know, the highlights. What's going on.
Yeah.
Because certainly the behavior highlight is important, and I think it's numbers that, you know, everybody should see, at least on the board. And some of the progress we're making with some of these cohorts. And, the results of the efforts that you put in the last year or two. So
I also think we really need to keep in the forefront of our mind the out of control situation we had facing us with teachers being out due to COVID, positions not being filled, and that we were teaching classes, teachers were spending their planning time teaching classes, and teachers leaving the district for various reasons, personal reasons, and yet we collectively did not lose sight that we didn't look for excuses. We continued to do the best we could under some really harsh conditions, behavioral and things out of our control.
Yeah.
And thank you, staff, for sticking with us.
And I think we acknowledge all the time about the impact that COVID has had on our learners,
Yes.
but COVID has also had a significant impact on the adults too.
Mhm.
absolutely.
And that was as you started to present your behavior data and those pieces, I made a note to Susan, and I probably didn't, you know, I would think about how I would word it differently, but the impact that COVID has had on the adults may also be a contributing
Yeah.
factor to that increase in office referrals,
Mhm.
because my diminished capacity to manage the other things that are happening in a post-pandemic world, I think people's capacity has been diminished. And so then you see that spike, right? So it's not just the kids, it's all of us
Mhm.
bringing some of that to the table too.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's going to open up a whole different discussion, but I think we also need to look at our society. Where are we at with civility in our society? So I'll just leave that comment there. Floating in the air.
I was going to mention that too, but I thought it was probably the wrong forum to
You
do
know,
that.
yeah.
We don't have slides for that. But yeah.
I think that behavior reflects society in today's day and age. Yes.
I agree.
You have anything?
I don't.
I will share one last data point that I think is exciting for us. We are at the point with our high school summer program where we have had learners recover 21 course credits by completing competency through Khan Academy and other tools. So that's 21 learners who would have been off course from graduation who are firmly back onto that track. I think that's been really great to see. So that's major kudos to our summer school staff who've done a great job.
All right.
Yeah, thank you guys, all of you, for bringing all of the slides, the great slides. They're a mess, but we love them. Yeah, there was very
I'll
thorough, so that was great for us to hear, and hopefully we can get, if we can get a capsulized version for the board, I think they would love that. I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to really pull all those slides into 1 to 2 sentences, but I will also do my best with that. But yeah, it's information that I think everybody really like to hear. Anything else? Fine, if not.
Thank you.
I know you guys have been saying that time's flying, so I don't want to take up any more of your time than necessary. But I really do appreciate this. This was great information. I got a lot to chew on. And thank you very, very much.
Welcome.
And I'm proud of you guys too. It's a lot of work.